So, yeah, this is the agency question from the 2015 paper, which is question 6. In terms of a question like this, if it's putting forward a thesis, somebody's saying this is how things work, what would be a useful thing to find and talk about?
People who disagree?
Disagree, not necessarily people, but what's easier to do? Is it easier to prove a thesis or disprove a thesis? Yeah, why is it easier to disprove it?
One case.
Yeah, you only need to find one thing. You need to find one thing that's inconsistent with it, and then you've disproved it. So what you want to think of is think of particular rules of agency law that might be difficult to reconcile with general rules of contract law. And that's really all you need to do. Although, looking at the quotation, once you've found some examples that look like they might be inconsistent with the thesis, then obviously you have to try to see if you can explain them. You have to think, well, what would Krebs, for example, say about that case? So you have to try and put the thesis at its strongest, even if you are going on then to try to disprove it. So you have to think, if you find something that looks like it's contrary to the thesis, you don't then stop. You try to say, well, how would somebody who's keen on that thesis try to explain that apparent inconsistency? And there is something that's important in the phrasing there that suggests to you how Krebs might try to do it. What could he say, based on the quotation there? So say you find a case that doesn't comply with normal rules of contract law, how might Krebs try to respond to that?
It's not a case of agency proper.
Yeah, good. So it's this important thing, he's talking about all cases of agency proper. So the question then is, okay, what does he mean by agency proper? What's his definition of agency? Would he want to exclude the example you've come up with by saying that's not really proper agency, that's something else? And is he allowed to do that? Is that okay as a tactic to say agency proper is different from agency generally? Is a thesis still sort of worthwhile, even if he's taking a narrow definition of agency, for example? But it is so. In the essay, you could say, right, well, here are these 3 cases I'm going to look at because they look like they're inconsistent with the thesis, and I'm going to consider how Krebs might try to explain those cases, and I'm going to consider whether a good theory of agency needs to explain those cases because they fall within agency proper. And, that's what you're going to do. Okay? And then, you choose your sort of 3 areas to look at. So those types of question, there's a fairly clear method you can adopt to try to answer those types of question. Okay? And then, that can give a pretty obvious structure to the essay. And let me see what I said in the feedback on that. So remember, on this past exam papers tab, as well as the past papers, there's the sort of feedback thing, general feedback on last year's exam. What do we say about that? Yeah, popular question, some very good answers. Some of them set out parts of the law where the thesis works well. Ostensible authority. So, for example, you could do that as well. You could say, well, here's a bit where the Krebs theory works well. So, ostensible authority, that looks a bit like just the objective theory of contracts. Like, if it was reasonable for me to believe that this person had authority, even though they didn't, objectively they can be bound. Objectively, the principal can be bound. Although, obviously, that's not the only way of explaining ostensible authority. And in the cases like Lord Diplock, in that, is it the Healy-Hutchison case, he talks about estoppel as a rationale for that. But, Krebs himself in that paper says there are bits that are harder to fit with the thesis. Undisclosed agency is the obvious example, because if the contracting party if the contracting party C, if C's got no idea that A is in fact an agent, C's got no idea that A is an agent acting for B, then on standard contractual principles, you can never say there's a contract between C and B, because C's not intending to make an offer to B. C's not intending to enter into a contract with B. C's got no idea who B is. But the way undisclosed agency works, if C later discovers that A was in fact an agent acting within the course of A's authority, C can take advantage of that by bringing a claim against B. Okay? So there's one of the cases they talk about this being a sort of windfall, providential windfall or something. So if it turns out, even though C didn't know at the time, if it turns out that A was an agent acting within the scope of their authority, C can then say to B, actually you can now be sued under this contract because A entered it on your behalf. Okay? And you can't really explain that in terms of normal contract principles. Then there's a question like for Krebs, well, is that agency proper? Is undisclosed agency proper? Then you've got to get into how does agency work? What are the other possible explanations for agency? You might say the important thing about agency is that A has a power to enter into contracts that bind B, and it's the creation of that power that's important, and that power can be exercised by A even if C is unaware of it at the time. Whereas a contract, to have a normal contract, yes, C's got a power to enter a contract with A, A's got a power to enter a contract with C, but they have to be aware of that, they have to be aware they're exercising that power. Whereas agency, the law of agency gives you something you don't otherwise have. It gives you the power to enter into contracts that are going to bind someone else. So the law of agency is giving you something that isn't there under the general law of contract. So what Krebs is trying to say is we can explain all this stuff just using general contract rules. We don't need a law of agency to come in and explain this. Whereas if instead you think, well, it's about A's power to enter contracts on behalf of somebody else, then that is an addition to the law. That is an extra thing, and you need a law of agency to explain it. Okay. The other thing, the other examples of ratification, that sort of Bolton and Lambert idea where you can, even though they're acting outside the scope of the authority, you can ratify that afterwards and say, that's okay, and then the contract can be binding, and the timing of how ratification works, and Bolton and Lambert deals with that. Krebs admits in the paper that Bolton and Lambert doesn't make sense on normal contractual principles. And as I said, that sign of the best answers was that even if they disagreed with the thesis, they put it at its strongest before doing so. Okay. So I guess you can sort of start off by saying, well, here's the idea. You can sort of see what he means, because you might see ostensible authority is just based on the general objective test of contract, so we can see why he's saying this, but here are these couple of cases that are a bit difficult for him. Could he come up with some way of getting out of them? Well, let's have a think about that. And if you think he can't really get out of them, then you might end up having to say, well, here are these rules that seem quite important, and they don't fit with the Krebs view, so perhaps we have to say that in addition to the law of contract, there is this thing called the law of agency, and we have it, and actually it might be quite a good thing, because it gives people important powers they wouldn't otherwise have, and those powers are quite important in commercial life, particularly for companies that have to act through agents a lot of the time. So it would be perhaps more elegant if we could explain it all through the law of contract, but ultimately that's not going to work. So, but is that a problem? I mean, there's no reason that we shouldn't have a thing called the law of agency. There's no reason why the law should just be contract and tort and property. You might have things like agency, bailment, other things knocking around, unjust enrichment. Okay? And you could say, actually, I mean, there is a tendency, isn't there, that people quite often want to try and explain things as being all about contract. Like, people used to say about unjust enrichment, that's all really just a contract. People say that about fiduciary duty, still they say it's already just contracts. Liability for pure economic loss in tort, like assumption responsibility, sometimes people say that's all contracts. People like to explain things as being about contract law because contracts are things that people have agreed to, so they're easier to justify, but you can't always do that, I don't think. Yeah, but that was just more about, because I think before people were saying you were a bit worried about essay questions, but there's a limited number of type of essay questions. You've got to think about the sort of method for approaching them. Good. But yeah, I will talk a bit more about agency next week because someone was asking about how the rules fit together, but I'll have to have a look over that before I do that. Anything else? Anything else from last year's paper? No? Good. So what do you want to talk about next time? We've got agency as a thing. What else? We don't have to do anything next time. I'm not desperately keen to come in at 9 on Wednesday. Yeah?
Maybe some essay type questions on contractual liability.
Yeah. Yeah, you can do that. Because it was the exam last year. We had a look at the problem question, but we could have a look at essay type questions on that. Anything else? Yeah, like measure of damages, remedies. I think remedies is a sensible thing to talk about because you can often get that. At the end of a problem question, you might be doing a problem question. And it might be about, whether there's been a breach or so on. It might be about the terms of the contract. But there could be an essay question. Sorry, at the end of a problem question, there might be a question of damages because you've worked out they've got a claim, but then you're still going to have to say, well, what damages are they going to get? So that can be important. So we've got agency, essay questions about pre-contractual liability, and sort of remedies, damages. Oh, the other thing I should have said, I did do this thing, like what happened last year, and it'd be nice if it didn't happen this year, but I expect it will happen this year. But people sent through lots of questions by email with increasing frequency as the exam got closer. And so, not just me, but the other people, the teaching fellows last year. So, Julius was a teaching fellow last year, and Mike Watkins, who's been teaching unjust enrichment this year, he was a teaching fellow in commercial. And so that they, as well, contributed to these answers. So, I'm grateful to them for that. But it meant there were lots of questions, and we did answer them, and these are all the answers. So, the point of making them available now is you might well have similar questions at some point, in which case, have a look here to see whether your question has been answered already, because it may well have been. Okay, and if it's not, obviously fine, just email me or Magda and we'll answer the question, but, people are asking lots of questions, which is fine, I'm glad you're interested, but I'd rather you ask the questions at the time rather than that close. But you know, they're there, and you might as well make that available. I mean, I think obviously, I don't want you to sort of, if you look at a question and you're not really sure why the person's asking that question, you know, don't worry too much about it. It might be to do with the way the lectures were last year or something. So I don't want you to sort of think, oh, you have to understand all these questions, but it's more like if there is something you want to ask about, have a look at this just in case it's already been dealt with. Okay? And yeah, if you could try and do that survey at some point, that'd be helpful.